I believe that we've just gone live, so it's my very great pleasure to introduce this event. Firstly, for those who've had any contact with Alex de Ruyter in the past, you may wonder why I look slightly differently and speak differently. That's because Alex's wife has been taken ill, and I've had to step in at the sort of literally the sort of last moment. I got notification last night, so apologies for that, but I hope I'll be able to fill Alex's shoes as adequately as I can. My name's Dr Steven McCabe. I'm an associate professor and senior fellow in the Centre for Brexit Studies. And firstly, almost exactly the 23rd of June 2016 will be 4.5 months next week today. And dare I say it, we're still in the situation where we have no certainty as to what the outcome of Brexit will be. It's possibly one of the sort of the longest running soap operas of recent times. But of course, as we know, we're in a sort of crisis, a pandemic caused by COVID, which has knocked off the sort of the front pages, which I suppose for many is a blessed relief. But nonetheless, we are coming to the end of the transition period, which will sort of officially end at 11 o'clock our time, or 12 o'clock or 12 a.m. Central European time, in just over a couple of weeks. So therefore, a lot remains to be sort of done in terms of what the free trade negotiations will raise. And of course, there's a lot of unknowns. So we shall sort of watch that with great interest. But of course, today's event it's about looking forward. What will sort of Britain be like in, if you like, a post-Brexit sort of period, insofar as that it has to sort of look towards the opportunities that sort of will exist in terms of the trade, and of course the sort of the jobs that we want to create, given of course the most pressing priority is in terms of creating the sort of recovery from COVID. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through the sort of the speakers for this great event, and what I'll then do is hand over to the sort of the first of those. We'll be sort of running in 15-minute slots, which will sort of allow the sort of speakers to sort of go through what they want to present, and then what we'll do is we'll have the sort of facility for you to provide or to sort of present a question, which I'll sort of pick up. And then at the sort of the end, in the sort of the last 15 minutes or so, depending upon how the speakers run, we'll have the sort of questions and answer slot. Okay, the first of our speakers is Suren Thiru. Suren is the head of economics at the British Chamber of Commerce. So oversees the Chamber's Commerce economic thought leadership, and is a regular commentator on UK economy, or the UK economy, featuring on TV and radio and the national press. He also leads on policy work to finance, Brexit, international trade and tax, and also contributes to the Chamber's policy ideas for economic growth and government spending. Prior to joining the BCC, he spent over 5 years as an economist at Lloyd's Banking Group. So Suren will be with us, or presenting immediately after I complete the introductions. So from 9:15 onwards, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. Our next speaker is Professor Nicola McEwen, and she's the Professor of Territorial Politics at the University of Edinburgh and the co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change, and specialises in nationalism, devolution and multi-level government, with a focus on Scotland and the UK in comparative perspective. So of course, Nicola will be able to give us a very good view of the potential for Brexit to have a big impact upon the sort of the union, which of course has been one of sort of the big issues right from the outset. And of course causes some concern, but dare I say it, the Scots may feel differently about the potential for Brexit, and whether it's turbocharged the move towards full breakaway, and whatever else that may indeed lead to. She's been examining the impact of Brexit on devolution and the future of the union since Brexit, of course, and is the first as a Brexit priority grant holder with the UK in a Changing Europe initiative, and is now one of its senior fellows. Her senior fellowship, A Family of Nations, Brexit, Devolution and the Union, explores how the Brexit process and its aftermath is shaping the territorial constitution and the power dynamics between the UK's constituent territories. She is also co-investigator on a multi-institutional ESRC large grant project between two unions, the Constitutional Challenge in the UK and Ireland after Brexit, and has led its research and intergovernment relations. So I look forward to hearing that. Our third speaker is Keith Stokes-Smith, who's the chairman of the Birmingham Commonwealth Association. Keith is a widely experienced business executive with a corporate accountancy background and is past president of the Greater Birmingham Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce, and is now its honorary chairman, president of the Birmingham Consular Association, and past consul for Lithuania, chairman of the Birmingham Commonwealth Association, chairman of Point 7 Worcester Management Limited, and advisor to the African Business Chamber. And finally, our last speaker, although actually it's, I'm reading from the list, and so forgive me, they won't actually be in this order, so I've swapped them around. David Hearne is a researcher at the Centre for Brexit Studies, and David joined the centre in 2017 as a researcher, having previously worked as an economist in a regional think tank, and David's primary research interests lie in the regional economics and the sectoral and regional impact of Brexit. So I hope you'll agree that we've got a really great range of speakers who will be able to look at different perspectives of what Brexit is going to have locally, nationally, internationally, and the potential opportunities that exist for all of us collectively. Right, okay, there's no point in delaying. So if Suren is ready, I'd invite you to unmute yourself and to give us your presentation, please.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to take my slot here as a representative of the British Chamber of Commerce to give you the business view of what we're seeing at the moment and what we'd like to see in the future around Brexit, around some challenges businesses are facing, as well as some of the opportunities. I'm going to cover some research we've done around Brexit preparedness for businesses, and maybe have a view of what some reasons why we're seeing some challenges around that. Also look forward what businesses want to see in a trade deal, if we get one, but also what they want to see going forward as well, which is going to be really important as we move into 2021 and hopefully the economic recovery from COVID and manage the impact of Brexit as well. So I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. Hopefully you can all see this. So here at British Chamber of Commerce, we run a research program which covers a whole range of things, from the economy to a wider range of issues as well. And one of the things we cover is around Brexit and trade policy as well. So we've done a bit of research over the last couple of years looking at how businesses have been prepared for Brexit even, and how that challenge has changed over recent years, what they've been doing, and whether that's split is different between different types of businesses. This first chart, we've asked whether businesses have done a risk assessment around the end of the transition period. This is our proxy for Brexit preparedness, and we've compared over recent years. And what you can see from the chart, in total, the blue bars, is that just 38% of businesses have done some sort of risk assessment around the end of the transition period, which is clear because I think it's quite as a pretty low number. And that number, when you break it down in terms of type of businesses, that number changes as many you would expect. So those who are more internationally active, those who are export, for example, much more of them had done some preparation work. And also by business size, you see large businesses doing more than smaller businesses. So there is this distinct split there. There's also a distinct regional split as well to the data, and that we have businesses in Northern Ireland doing more, unsurprisingly, than those in other parts of the country as well. How does this look compared to previous years? Well, unfortunately, what we've seen on the data is that preparation levels actually dropped compared to recent years. So this year, as in 2020, we asked the question, 38% of businesses said that they'd done a risk assessment. This is down from 57% last year. And again, the number is different compared to different types of businesses. For example, international active businesses, the number is higher, and also for large businesses as well compared to smaller businesses and those that are UK only focused. And the concern for us in the moment is that a number of these businesses, particularly UK only focused businesses, aren't necessarily proofing their own business. You know, they may not necessarily trade with the EU directly, but they may be part of a large supply chain where the end customer has huge exposure to the EU. So that's a bit of concern for us. And we've delved in a little bit of detail as well in the next slide in terms of what businesses have been focusing on in terms of their preparations. Now in July, Michael Gove wrote to businesses outlining the steps they need to take to prepare for changing the movement of goods between UK and the EU. He outlined 8 steps. These include things like getting a URI number. As you can see from the data, for pretty much all the steps that are outlined, preparation levels are pretty low. But what the stark thing to point out from this chart is right at the bottom is those who respond to none of these. And you can see over half of businesses have done none of these steps in preparation for the end of the transition period. So that's clearly a concern. Now, again, the split is very stark when compared to UK only businesses, where some of these don't apply, of course, whereas internationally active businesses, that number falls to a quarter. So you see again that there's that sort of similar story we're seeing there, where overall preparation levels are less than we would like. I think that's safe to say, but clearly there is that sort of split between what type of business you are, where you are in the country, and also what type of size, what business size you are as well. So there's a couple of reasons for this. Again, looking at our research, one of the reasons is the impact of COVID on the economy. We can't split that away from the impact it's having on the Brexit process, on Brexit preparedness among businesses. And this chart shows one of the things from one of these sort of key indicators from our economic survey, and it's around cash flow. And one of the biggest hits to businesses from the pandemic has been on cash reserves, cash flow. That's taken a huge hit. For example, at the moment, our research shows that around 1 in 3 businesses have less than 3 months or more, 3 months or less worth of cash in reserve. That's clearly a concern when they're, giving the hit to their businesses from the first lockdown, the second set of restrictions, on what might happen going forward. But the other impact has been is that we've heard again, sort of from a number of businesses, is that this has impacted their ability to prepare for the energy transition period, because many of them had to run down some of their stockpiles that they may have built up during 2019 in the run up to the sort of various cliff edges during last year, but also for business bandwidth more generally. The businesses over the first sort of 6 to 10 months of this year, Brexit wasn't really on the horizon because everyone was totally consumed with COVID, and it's only really been something that businesses have turned their attention to during the latter part of this year. And that's particularly, again, true for the smaller businesses than large businesses who may be more in a position to sort of war game what may happen post the end of the transition period. Another reason why is that there's still major gaps in government guidance about what happens next. So BCC have been in consultation with our local chambers of commerce. I've been looking at what the key questions that businesses need answering around what happens at the end of the transition period. And we came up with a list of 35 questions, and this covers a huge range of things from rules of origin, from tariffs to VAT, to movement of data, etc. And what we found is that 24 out of those 35 questions still haven't got a satisfactory answer. So in many ways for businesses, and this is we hear all the time, preparing for Brexit at the moment is a bit like trying to hit a moving target, because there's so much uncertainty out there. There's so much ambiguity about what might happen, about critical elements of how businesses may need to operate after the 1st of January. So again, it's feeding into what we're seeing in some of those earlier charts, in that there's a lot of Brexit fatigue among businesses, as many would expect, as probably the general population. But actually the absence of clear, actionable information is also a real barrier. And that's really a real concern, given how close we are to the 1st of January. And I think what we're also seeing is that in some ways there is a certain subset of businesses who are actually hoping that a deal will actually end all these uncertainties, and there won't be a sort of big period of adjustments, where actually, of course, deal or no deal, there's going to be a huge number of adjustments come the 1st of January. And these are just a few examples from the queries we've got back through our research. Actually, there's quite a wide range of questions that businesses are still answering. For example, right at the bottom, the government, they're talking about the government's website being confusing. There's questions around whether they need Irish URI number if they trade with Ireland. And there's concern around the clarification about the cost of export declarations, for example. So there's a query around VAT. So there's still a huge range of areas that are still businesses are still asking questions about. And the fact that they're not getting a clear, actionable information is actually a real barrier to what happens next. I think that's a real sort of important sort of context of what may happen next, because even if you do get a deal, there's still going to be plenty of issues come the 1st of January. And that's something we need to be really alive to. So that's the first part of the presentation. Just following up on that, after sort of looking at the preparation stuff, just a few sort of additional thoughts around where we see the prospect for the deal, and also what we see potentially in early 2021. Now, businesses across the UK we've been speaking to are watching and waiting avidly each day, looking at what may be happening with prospect of getting a deal, to-ing and fro-ing, all the politicking. I think that's consumed a lot of businesses over the last few weeks. There's a lot of frustration because they don't quite know what is coming next. But in many ways, what we're seeing at the moment is not really surprising. Anyone who's done a trade deal, any businesses who've done a deal, these go to the last minute more often than not. So we shouldn't be surprised where you're at the moment. Also, there are quite unique aspects to this deal in particular. I think, the EU, from the EU side, doing a deal that increases barriers as opposed to decreases barriers from what was there previously, I'm sure it's a quite unique position for them to be in. And of course, from the UK perspective, it's again, there's a political aspect for it, but also again, it's the UK in a position where they're not really negotiating trade deals in any significant way for the past 40 years. And doing this over such a short period of time is always going to bring us challenges. But of course, that's little comfort for businesses who are in a position where they're trying to plan but haven't got the clear answers to go forward. Now, our expectation at the moment is that there will be a deal. There will be deals struck over the next couple of weeks. We think some of the politicking that's beginning over the last couple of weeks is essentially laid the groundwork for a very thin deal, and that may go through. I think the challenge maybe is not necessarily UK Parliament, and potentially EU Parliament, and whether there may be some complications there going forward. I think that's something that we're watching out quite closely. Now, of course, it's crucial we do get a deal, even if it is a thin deal, either it is late in the day, because a no deal would be a major impact on the UK economy. Now, of course, the focus this year has been the impact of COVID on the UK economy. Now, it's my view that that Brexit would be a much bigger impact on the UK economy than COVID, because of course, COVID, while a significant impact on the UK economy, is still essentially a temporary shock to the UK economy, and the economy, once we get a massive vaccine rolled out, the economy will bounce back, albeit with some long-term challenges still to address, such as structural unemployment, private debt levels as well. But of course, not getting a Brexit deal would be a sort of a structural shift for the UK economy. Now, a lot of the focus has been in the press and in politicians about some of the short-term challenges around rising food prices, delays at the border, which of course can create huge issues, and they may have an impact on economic growth in the first quarter of next year, and also things like inflation as well. But what we're quite concerned about is if you don't get a deal, is some of those long-term structural issues they may create. We think it may create issues around exacerbating some of the longer-term structural unemployment that we're likely to see as a result of COVID. Not in the same sectors, so COVID's likely to create sort of structural unemployment in places like hospitality. You can't expect hospitality to be the same size as it was pre-COVID and post-COVID. Similarly, we think there'll be challenges from Brexit around long-term unemployment in some sort of manufacturing type sectors, automotive in particular, those who rely and sort of have a keen exposure to the EU, where some of their business model may be less viable than it was than it is at the moment. So that could create issues. We're also concerned about the long-term competitiveness of the UK if we don't get a deal. So we're concerned about issues around investment, which has really been really weak over the last couple of years. That may be exacerbated over the next couple of years, particularly foreign direct investment. And so it's really important that we do get a deal. We also think that if we do get a deal, it shouldn't be viewed as we think it should be viewed as a platform rather than a ceiling for the UK's aspirations for its future trade relationship with the EU. Now, it's probably not something that many people want to hear, but we think the government should continue to talk if they do get a deal, to make sure that some of the gaps that inevitably are going to be in the first deal that they come up with are filled over the next couple of years, so we do get that sort of bespoke trading relationship going forward. And just lastly from me, I mean, I think it's often this is very much a political discourse as sort of shaped the Brexit debates and the issues around the trade deal. But of course, it's important to remember that it is businesses that trade, not governments. So it's businesses that ultimately make a success of any future relationship, not the government. That's really important. But equally, it's important that government does its best to make it as easy as possible to help businesses trade in a post-Brexit world. And so that means looking at strengthening the relationship with the EU going forward. I think that's going to be really important. What we also think is going to be important is that if we do get a deal, is looking at ways of smoothing that transition into 2021. This means looking at some sort of policy easements that can help smooth the way forward. Because as I mentioned earlier, even if we do get a deal, there's still likely to be significant disruption, given the lack of the limits on preparedness among some businesses, but also the last minute nature of this deal. That's going to be really important. And I think what this should include, for example, is temporary waiving of some of the penalties that some hauliers may face if they come to the border, come to ports with the wrong paperwork. For example, there may be currently there's a plan for £300 fine. We think that could be waived for the first couple of months because mistakes are inevitable over the first few months of the post-transition world. So I think that needs to be looked at as well. On mutual recognition of professional qualifications, I think that needs to be looked at again at some easements around that. UK government could look to unilaterally recognise qualifications from the EU and work with EU member states to do the same likewise. Again, they keep that flow moving over what is going to be challenging few months if we get a deal or not. So in summary for me, I think there's a lot of opportunities post-Brexit to strengthen the relationship with the EU. That's going to be really important. That's overwhelming feedback we get from our members. But also a lot of members also talking about looking at exploiting some of the other opportunities that new technology brings. That's in the international trade process going forward, opening new opportunities, opening new markets as well. And I think, lastly, what's really going to be important as we try to build UK's competitiveness in a post-Brexit world is how we sort of trigger greater levels of private sector investment in the UK, by foreign direct investment, but also getting businesses invested again, because that's again a real legacy issue from the financial crisis, that businesses have been investing much less than in the competitor countries. That's going to be really important. So we need government to be looking at that as well, in the budgets next year, looking at ways of incentivising investment using taxes to do that. With that, I'll hand back to Stephen. I look forward to the Q&A.
Nice. Okay. Just to ask a couple of follow-up questions. I mean, so come obviously the 1st of January is a Friday, so that's a week or 2 weeks Friday. So assuming that everyone goes back to work on the 4th, what do you think the biggest priority will be?
So I think at the moment, we've been looking at sort of trade volumes over the last, because one of the things that Chambers of Commerce do, they're part of the trading process, so they can actually monitor sort of some of the trade volumes as they come through. And what we've seen in previous years, trade volumes actually tend to be pretty low over that first period of the year. It's simply because it's just after Christmas period and things take a little while to ramp up. So I think it may be a few days before we see the actual impact at ports, for example. So I think the priority should be looking at pinpointing where are the key areas that need to be addressed, where there becomes frictions in certain ports. I think that needs to be looked at quite closely. There also needs to be clarity on the chain of command within government about who decides what happens if there are issues at ports across the country, or specific issues that do arise. I think that's a slight concern for us, that if issues do arise, there's not that much clarity in terms of how it will be addressed. And clearly, if they're not addressed in a prompt fashion, it could, the backlogs could be exacerbated.
Okay, yeah. I mean, again, Nicola's our next speaker talking about Scotland, but and I'm not trying to sell the book, but I co-authored a book on which is titled "English Regions After Brexit." Do you see that sort of there may be opportunities for, in particular, sort of the likes of Birmingham and the Midlands, in terms of I don't know, being much freer of Westminster, or how do you see that sort of playing out in coming years?
Well, one of the feedback we get from regions is that one thing they're quite interested in is what's going to replace the EU funding, the sort of structural funding that came through beforehand. So we've heard sort of obviously some announcements around the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And I think a lot of focus is on that and how that's going to help support projects sort of post the transition period. Because obviously that feeds into a lot of sort of regeneration schemes and lots of local supports, business support schemes as well. So I think a lot of focus that we hear sort of from our local chambers is more around how can you sort of avoid that sort of cliff edge in sort of EU funding. I think that's going to be sort of immediate priority in the first part of this year. Now we've also had the announcement of spending review around the UK Shares Prosperity Fund being launched, but we've not really had much clarity beyond that. Obviously, just announced a few pilot schemes as well. I think that's going to be a sort of immediate priority for a lot of businesses. I see that as an opportunity maybe to shape what may happen going forward, because they simply don't want to cut and paste job from what they had previous, and I think they are looking to shape that. And from our point of view, there needs to be a strong business voice in terms of how a replacement for those EU sort of funding envelopes are changed going forward, and that's really crucial as well going forward.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, we'll come back to this in the question and answer session, but how to do trade deals that affects everyone and leave it right to the last minute is this is if we ever do Brexit again, this is not how to do it. And I suspect there'll be a lot of tinkering in coming months. I mean, I don't. It's far from perfect. Anyway, thanks, Suren, and that's great. And we'll be coming back to you hopefully with questions at the end. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Nicola McEwen. Actually, I noticed, Nicola, you're muted. So if you unmute yourself. So yeah, without further ado, I'll introduce you, and you'll talk about the Scottish perspective.
Thanks very much. I'll talk a bit about the Scottish perspective, but I want to talk broadly about the effects of Brexit on devolution. Inevitably, a lot of the discussions this week and last week have been about the deal or no deal scenario and what that means for trade across the UK's external border with the European Union. But my contribution will focus very much on the internal borders within the United Kingdom and what Brexit means and the challenges it's presenting for the UK's territorial constitution. As we know, the narrow leave vote in 2016 masked some very deep territorial cleavages, didn't mask them very well, exposed them, I suppose, in Brexit preferences, with very strong majority for Remain in Scotland, fairly strong majority for Remain in Northern Ireland, albeit one that was it also exposed deep tensions and differences within Northern Ireland, of which we have been very familiar over decades. And that has raised some issues about and challenges, in a sense, about how to fundamentally change a state and its relationship and with its neighbours, its place in the world, without the consent of all of its constituent parts. Put simply, the Brexit referendum, legally speaking, was a UK-wide ballot. All that mattered was the result of the UK-wide vote, and legally, that 2 of the 4 constituent territories voted Remain had absolutely no bearing on the outcome. But politically, it matters, and it matters in part because in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, we see grievances resulting from having had to leave the European Union against their will, if you use the phrases that politicians use. But also all of that has been exacerbated by having the devolved institutions having very little opportunities to influence UK Brexit policy. From the devolved perspective, there is a distinction between policy that is made for the UK and policy that is made by the UK government, and they feel that where there is a policy such as an external relations policy, especially in relations with Europe, where it touches fundamentally on areas of devolved competence, albeit that external relations is a matter for the UK Parliament, they feel that they have a legitimate contribution to make to shaping that policy. And there are protocols and concordats in place to facilitate that. New institutions were set up to try to facilitate a coordinated approach, but in the event, they have had very little influence over the direction of travel of UK Brexit policy. Most notably for the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government, they were very clear from the outset that their preference, if they have to have a Brexit at all, would be for the softest Brexit. And clearly that has had no impact on shaping policy. The prospect of a hard Brexit, whether it's a thin deal or no deal at all, is creating anxieties in the devolved territories, just as it's creating many anxieties elsewhere. The First Ministers of Scotland and Wales had asked formally for an extension to the transition period because of COVID, because of the pressures that COVID was putting them and others under. But again, that was another episode where they had really no influence over the process. So all of that has created, on top of the initial grievance, if you like, stemming from the referendum itself, it's created a new layer of frustration and dismay at the authority, the opportunity to influence that the devolved governments have in excuse me, in what is a major constitutional change for the UK. On top of all of that are anxieties about the impact that Brexit is having on devolution itself and on the status and the authority of the devolved institutions within the United Kingdom. Now, there's no doubt that the repatriation of competences, of powers returning from the EU to the UK, does create some challenges for devolution, challenges that were not envisaged at the time that the devolved institutions were established. The UK government makes, while we were members of the European Union and in this period of transition, the UK Parliament and the devolved legislatures are equally obliged to make their laws compatible with EU law. So they are all within the same EU regulatory umbrella, if you like. And coming out of that, with EU exit, and in particular with an exit that entails leaving the single market, does mean that there is the possibility of more divergence. There's always been divergence, but more divergence in regulations within the UK, where previously that had been contained by EU regulations. So that was a challenge, and all of the governments recognised that that was a challenge, and they have been involved in a process over a number of years to explore whether they needed to, and whether they desired to, develop what are called UK common frameworks. So common frameworks to replace EU regulations in areas that were formerly the subject of EU law. And that has been a rare example of cooperation and joint working and really productive working between the four administrations in a process that was very much one that they co-owned. So they were coming around the table as equals to explore and do what they call deep dives into looking at these particular issues. And in the end, they have agreed that of, I can't remember the exact numbers, there are around 155 or so areas of EU regulation that intersected with devolved competence. For the most part, they've agreed that they don't need a framework at all. And then there are around 20 or so where they feel that they need a framework, but it doesn't have to be in law. And then another 20 or so where they agree that there is a need for a legal underpinning, a legal framework. And that's by agreement, and that's been ongoing, and we are seeing some of the fruits of that in recent weeks and months, but it's still a ways to go. So an intergovernmental approach is one of the options for addressing that new challenge of Brexit, the new challenge created by the repatriation of competences. You communicate, you cooperate, you co-decide where appropriate, you proceed by agreement, and the Common Frameworks Programme is one way to do that. But there's another way, and the other way is to centralise authority, to centralise power, and to limit the extent to which the devolved governments can make policies that are going to or potentially increase regulatory divergence. And that's primarily the path that the current administration has taken, and it's taken it in particular in the UK Internal Market Bill. Now, you may be familiar with this, it's been in the news a little bit because it's the subject of a bit of a battle between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's gone through the House of Commons, it's gone through the House of Lords, and it's now in that process that they call ping pong, where the two houses are trying to battle it out to see who will win out in the end. But the House of Lords has been quite adamant that the bill undermines devolution, and that's very much my position and position of my colleagues, that the provisions within the Internal Market Bill, which fundamentally are about introducing market access principles to make sure that that businesses don't face any barriers to trade within the UK after Brexit, to create legal certainty is the justification given for businesses trading across the UK. The effects of that will weaken devolution. The effects of that will mean that the devolved institutions no longer will be able to make laws that affect all activity within their territory. And perhaps we might want to come back on that in the discussion. But it's a biggie, and there are some concessions being made by the UK government, as I reported last night. I doubt they will go far enough to secure consent from the devolved institutions. But the main point I want to make here is that this approach about shoring up authority centrally and minimising the reach of the devolved institutions is a fundamental change to the UK's territorial constitution. It's a fundamental challenge to devolution, and it is being resisted and opposed by certainly the Scottish and the Welsh government. A little bit more complicated in Northern Ireland, given the complexities of Northern Ireland's status post-Brexit. But all of that is contributing to the return of the politics of independence, particularly within Scotland. Now, it's not that long ago since we had an independence referendum in Scotland in 2014, where the result, if you remember, was that 55% voted no to independence, 45% voted yes. Now, my thoughts at the time were that the result was clear enough to be accepted, but also close enough to ensure that the debate would continue. And when the SNP went into the 2016 Scottish Parliament elections, they had a manifesto commitment that of independence said two things. One, that they would seek a new independence referendum if two conditions were met. One, if there was clear and sustained evidence that independence had become the preferred option of a majority of the Scottish people, or if there was a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as, and I'm quoting, Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. So the second condition obviously was met for the reasons that we have been discussing, but the first condition also, it looks like it is being met too. So from the beginning of 2020, support for independence had already increased to around 50-50. The Scottish Social Attitudes Survey published this year indicated what we suspected anyway from opinion polls, that the increased support for independence was driven by Remainers. Since the summer of this year, every opinion poll, I think there have been 14, possibly 15 opinion polls since June, across different polling firms with different methodologies, have shown a majority of support for independence, ranging from 51% to 59%, saying that they would vote yes. And what's interesting is that that's across every age demographic except the over 65, so perhaps suggesting something of a demographic shift. However, although there is no doubt that Brexit has created a political opportunity for advocates of independence, for some it's created an imperative to revisit the issue of Scottish independence so soon after the 2014 referendum, it's also created new challenges that weren't there before, that weren't there in the 2014 context. One of those is a challenge of process. It's about the authority to hold an independence referendum. That authority constitutionally lies with Westminster, certainly for a referendum with a similar question as the last one. And last time around, David Cameron's government had recognised after the election that the SNP had a mandate. He indicated a willingness to negotiate a transfer of power to facilitate a referendum law in the Scottish Parliament. And partly he might have done all of this because he had confidence that it would be defeated at that time. But also there is no constitutional barrier to independence in the UK, unlike, for example, in Spain. But all of those, apart from the last one there, all of the rest of those things are different now. There still isn't a constitutional barrier, but there is not the same recognition from the UK government. In fact, the opposite. There is not the same willingness to negotiate a transfer of power, and there's definitely not the same confidence that they would defeat independence in a referendum. But on the substance, and this is where I'll close, Brexit also challenges what independence means for Scotland. Many of the assumptions in the independence platform in 2014 had assumed that there would be lots of continuities in cross-border trade and integrated labour market, shared energy systems, shared social security systems for a period, many more areas where it was assumed that there would be a shared governance of institutions, functional things like the DVLA, or well, actually not the DVLA in that case, but things like that, issuing of passports, you know, these sorts of things, functional services that might continue to be done on a cross-border basis. And all of that was relatively easy to do within the context of the EU internal market, but that's much more difficult now. And if independence was to mean Scotland seeking to rejoin the European Union as an independent member state, then the issue of the border between Scotland and the rest of the UK comes into play in a future referendum in a way that it wasn't in any significant way in 2014. And we've seen from the debates around the borders in Ireland, on the island of Ireland and between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, that the integrity of the internal market from the EU perspective means that you have to have some sort of effective system of border management. If that was what was in prospect for the English-Scottish border, then that makes it more difficult to win a referendum, and it makes it more difficult to establish independence thereafter. So political opportunities, but also political risks.
Right. Thank you, Nicola. Right on time, and possibly just slightly over. The one thing I've always liked about the sort of the EEC, as it was in the EU, is the sort of the lack of borders. We need to live in a world without borders, not with them. But okay, we will return to that. But I'm conscious of time, so what I'm going to do is to sort of go straight into sort of David Hearne, who's from the Centre of Brexit Studies, so a colleague, and he's going to give his presentation now. Oh, David, if you can unmute yourself. I can't hear you.
I am not muted.
Oh, that's better.
I am not muted. I have
right,
muted myself, so there is obviously a
we can hear you now.
technological barrier, let's say.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Right, so I've been asked to give a quick overview of the kind of economic situation in which we find ourselves immediately pre-Brexit. So I intend this discussion to be A, brief, and to consist of 3 parts. Initially, I will discuss and look at the kind of very short-term impacts, which are, as everyone will be aware, absolutely dominated by the ongoing pandemic, the COVID crisis, and everything involved with that. That dwarfs the magnitude of changes is just enormous, and it dwarfs anything else in the immediate term. I will then discuss sort of longer term view, where actually COVID fades from view somewhat, and Brexit is expected to have a much larger, longer term impact on the UK economy than COVID. So I think that's something that worth bearing in mind. And finally, I'll discuss a little bit around what might be in prospect, looking forward, what might be in prospect in the immediate and slightly longer term, notwithstanding issues raised by Nicola around the UK's territorial integrity, as we may be talking about a kind of Greater England and Wales rather than a coherent UK in future. So I leave that issue to one side. This graph is frankly astonishing. This looks at this is a monthly gross domestic product from the Office for National Statistics from January 1997 through to I think it's October, the latest data in 2020. And as you can see, in normal times, GDP exhibits a fairly steady growth path over time. We've seen a kind of steady increase in the size of the UK economy, certainly up until the financial crisis. The financial crisis is very visible, and it had a significant, severe and long-lasting impact on the UK economy. You'll note that after the crisis, GDP never returned to its previous trend, which is unusual. We've actually seen one of the slowest periods of growth, even before the pandemic struck, than we've had for many years. And if you look at the figures on a per capita basis, they look even worse. The pandemic has seen a contraction of a magnitude that has not been seen in my lifetime or the lifetime of anyone else who will be listening to this call. Unless you were alive in 1919, 1920, 1921, you will not have seen a recession or a kind of change in the size of the economy of this magnitude. So this is frankly astonishing. It's unbelievable, but it's also perhaps less than what it appears, because the impact of this certainly is expected to be, it will have longer term impacts, of course, but the initial contraction is actually relatively short lasting. If you look at the speed of recovery, you'll see that this is almost an economy that's been shut down by government fiat, as was the case during the first lockdown. And as soon as that sort of ends, then you see an immediate jump back up. Now, how that pans out moving forward over time is another question, and I'd certainly expect to see economic damage through to 2025. But I think we can anticipate something reasonably robust once we see a mass rollout of a vaccine, etc. Unemployment is always a lagging indicator, and I've charted figures both for the UK as a whole and the West Midlands. What we can see is during the recession of the early 1990s, unemployment reached fairly high levels, hit 10%, over 10% actually in the UK as a whole, and just about hit 12% in the West Midlands. So the West Midlands has been kind of fairly consistently worse affected by recessions, at least in terms of employment, than other parts of the UK. The two series converge through the kind of long period of growth that we saw, first under John Major's government and later under the new Labour government. We see a sort of deterioration in 2005, 2006 that's associated with a period of quite rapid deindustrialization, and then a huge jump in unemployment during the financial crisis. And it's again worth noting that the West Midlands was notably worse affected than the rest of the UK in employment terms than that. Now, this figure, I suspect, should be a lot higher than it currently is. You can see the sort of COVID-related increase. Part of that is the impact of the furlough scheme, coronavirus job retention scheme, to give it its proper name, stopping the kind of level of mass redundancies that you'd normally expect to see from a crisis of this magnitude. But partly that's just because official unemployment is very much a lagging indicator, and perhaps the claimant count will give you a more coherent view of how this is likely to be affecting people on the ground. And again, we see an enormous jump in April in particular of this year in the number of people claiming universal credit, specifically the unemployment related section of universal credit. So we see that certainly at the sort of low paid end of the job market, marked deterioration in the circumstances of quite a lot of people. And again, you see, although the size of the jump is similar in the West Midlands and UK as a whole, the situation in the West Midlands is somewhat worse than the UK average. So again, that's something worth noting, and that's something that will be worth keeping an eye on as furlough comes to an end come March, and the longer restrictions go on and the longer COVID goes on, the worse that will look. So that's the short-term picture, very much dominated by COVID. That sort of dwarfs any impact that an event like Brexit could and will have in the short term. But perhaps more troubling is the longer term view. And here we see some sort of fairly remarkable things. We see a complete stall in growth of business investment 2015, 2016. So this is private sector business investment. So this doesn't include investment that the government has undertaken. This doesn't include anything done by the public sector. And this is purely private sector business investment. And we see that's very much stalled since 2016. And if you look at what has happened on a sort of industry by industry basis, that does appear to be driven by industries that are heavily international focused. So you see automotive investment drops off a cliff after 2015, for example. Investment in new plant and machinery really, really dramatically dives. And I think that's something that will have a longer term impact on the UK's ability to continue growing as we look forward into the late 2020s and beyond. That if this period of sort of stalled investment carries on, then we will find ourselves falling behind elsewhere. We will find living standards lower than they otherwise would be. And again, I know it's difficult to see here, but the UK has long been plagued by underinvestment relative to its continental peers. I take the EU 27 average, but if you look at figures for France, for example, they look very similar. You look at figures for Germany, they also look similar. Italy's a bit of an outlier, but the Italian situation is itself not good. And again, what you see is these two lines more or less move in tandem. Over the period of the Eurozone crisis, you see that investment in the EU stalls, and that's more or less what we'd expect to see. The recovery in the UK starts earlier, again, because we didn't have the Eurozone crisis, being in control of our own currency. And again, you see this divergence from 2016, 2017 in particular onward, where the situation in the UK rather stalls and the rest of Europe recovers. Business investment in 2020 has sort of dropped off a cliff again, but that's due to COVID rather than anything else. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the rest of the year and moving forward into next year. So That's the situation as it stands. And in the remaining 3 or 4 minutes, I just want to outline what the situation might look like moving forward. And I'd caution that whatever deal is agreed, and everyone will have different perspectives on the likelihood of something being agreed, but whatever deal is agreed, there will be very, very substantial new barriers to trade between the UK and the rest of the EU. That will mean for businesses that you will need to get your head around all kinds of additional customs barriers that were not in place before. We know for a fact that even if a deal is fully agreed, that companies will need to ensure that they fully comply with rules and regulations around rules of origin. You'll need, if you export products into the EU and you wish to take advantage of any zero tariff, zero quota rules, you will need to demonstrate that you have fully adhered to rules of origin. That, for a number of sectors, actually poses quite significant barriers, because you need to find out the local content of your entire supply chain. That's one level. Rules of origin will also differ across sector. It's actually quite a complex area, so companies will need to get their heads around that. Export declarations will need to be filled in, and we face the prospect of quite significant sanitary and phytosanitary barriers under certain scenarios as well, which will be a very significant impediment to trade. So all of that will render firms less competitive when attempting to import and export from the EU. Now, it remains to be seen what impact that change in competitiveness will have upon productivity levels. But generally, international evidence suggests that if trade becomes more difficult, productivity tends to drop, certainly relative to what it would have been. So all of that put together suggests that certainly by the middle of the next decade, and from 2024, 2025 onwards, we'll see quite a significant drag on growth in the UK relative to what it would have been, and that impact will eventually dwarf the longer term impacts from the pandemic. And that's something that's very much worth noting, and will increasingly, I think, become an issue as we look forward in future political times. That will be something that future governments might look to change, might look to address, but it's very much something worth keeping an eye on, that these barriers will have long-term impacts, not merely in the short term. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Those of us who know our history will know that one of the reasons for joining the EEC on the 1st of January 1973, so what's that, just slightly under 48 years ago, was because in the sort of the post Second World War period following austerity, we'd fallen behind the countries that sort of formed the base of what became the EEC. So I do wonder if there will be a sort of similar push in amongst subsequent generations to rejoin what seemed to be sort of an economic powerhouse. But then, as we always know, that Brexit, from my perspective, is a bit of a left side, right side calculation. It's overtly political, but at the heart of it is trade. And so, certainly from what you're saying, it would not appear that we're going to get the sort of the turbocharged economy that we were promised, certainly by the sort of Leave side of the campaign. But anyway, that's the politics, and we can come back to that in the question and answer session. I'm conscious of time, and I'd like to actually sort of get to our last but not least speaker, Keith Stokes-Smith, which I introduced a while ago. So Keith, if I can invite you to give us your presentation, please.
Thank you, Steve. Well, as if having to deal with the impact of COVID was not enough, and the economic slowdown of many countries, including China, we are, of course, now having the 31st of December looming and the new regime surrounding our trading with the EU. Other critical issues, of course, facing us, indeed the world, which are probably in the background at the moment, are issues like climate change, food security, rising populations, unemployment, etc., etc. Whatever the deal with the EU on trade after 31st of December, EU trade agreements will not apply to the UK, of course. So what's our future trading relationship? Well, the EU is an important trading partner, we all recognise that. However, I'm going to focus beyond the EU on the 53 Commonwealth nations we trade with. Our trade as a country with the Commonwealth has generally hovered around 9%, that's both imports and exports. this is clearly not a significant figure, indeed as much the same level as our exports to Germany. Only 10 Commonwealth nations feature in our top 50 trading partners, headed by India, from which we import more than we export to, followed shortly after by Canada, Australia and September. But 10 in the top 50 is quite disappointing. Having said that, with a 9% import-export ratio, that's probably not too surprising either. One could be tempted to think from that we should not be too concerned, not lose too much sleep about Brexit and its impact on our trading relationship with the Commonwealth or the Commonwealth per se. But then that is not the way the UK have viewed the Commonwealth in the past, notwithstanding our joining the EU. Trade is seen by us as a way of supporting developing Commonwealth countries and reducing poverty. We want to see their economies grow. We want to see the creation of jobs and reduce their resilience on overseas aid in the long term. Indeed, the UK has always recognised and championed the special needs and challenges facing the least developed countries, small states and sub-Saharan Africa. Excuse me, 24 Commonwealth countries send more than 30% of their exports through the EU to the UK. For example, we're the largest importer of sugar into the EU, buying almost 80% of sugar imports from Belize and 70% from Fiji, the latter accounting for 95% of Fiji's UK export earnings. So where are we with our trading relationship with the Commonwealth countries? As at 10th of December, the UK had secured 28 trade agreements with 57 countries, including Commonwealth countries, some replicating the existing agreements between the EU and these countries. In the process, it became possible to reduce the size of some of these agreements from 1,400 pages to 40 pages by eliminating areas of differentiation. We have so far entered into agreements with Canada, Singapore, Eastern and Southern Africa, which includes Mauritius, Seychelles and Zimbabwe. And based on the current trade flows, this is good news for some of those countries. For some of them, for example, they could save £30 million a year in tariff charges, and in others 10 million or 8 million, depending on the product concerned. So it's a benefit for them, falling in line with our overall Commonwealth objectives. And notably, consumers in the UK will also benefit from these trade agreements with greater choice and better supply chains. Trade agreements have also been entered into with the Pacific states being Fiji and Papua New Guinea, Southern African Customs Union and Mozambique comprising Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia and South Africa, as well as Swatini, former Swaziland. And also in the with countries like Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, the Republic of Guyana, Jamaica, St. Christopher, Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So quite a significant number of countries, although a lot of them, of course, are quite small ones. Negotiations are ongoing with India and Australia, surprisingly, given they're in our top importers and exporters. But yes, India and Australia continue to negotiate, as do New Zealand. Other negotiations continue with Cameroon, Ghana and Bangladesh, Uganda, Rwanda and Kenya. Or sorry, with Kenya actually it's already been settled, much to the annoyance of some of the other African countries. With regard to Pakistan, which is not really a major importer or exporter to the UK, again, existing arrangements are in place and will mirror those with the EU, although the UK wish in the longer term to improve its trading relationship with Pakistan. And of course, two of the EU countries are also Commonwealth countries, which is Cyprus and Malta, which of course, and they do in fact appear in the top 50 trading nations, Commonwealth trading nations we trade with. And what about the pound and the impact this will have on them? Whilst a weaker pound would make UK exports more competitive, tariffs imposed on the UK by the EU, of course, would increase the cost of exports to these two countries and other countries. UK exports of goods and services to the Commonwealth at the present, or certainly last year, were in the region of £65 billion, while imports totaled about 64 billion, so very much a similar figure. The growth in imports from Canada and India have in fact driven up this figure latterly. A falling pound also means, of course, dearer imports. Conversely, the UK becomes more attractive to tourists. Many Commonwealth countries rely upon the UK for a good percentage of their exports, and therefore will have welcomed entering into a trade agreement with the UK on the same or better terms than they had with the EU. The UK absorbs some 18% of Commonwealth developing nation exports, and it's the fourth most important market for them after the USA, China and Japan. Brexit-related shocks arising from a weaker pound and possible trade disruption resulting from the coronavirus may of course leave them exposed. Standard Chartered Bank recently said, and I quote, "The UK has much to gain when considering trade potential by looking further afield to nations like Nigeria, Pakistan and India, the latter already being the UK's largest Commonwealth trading partner, albeit still only 17th in the top 50, but noted as providing sizable growth potential." Looking at the West Midlands, Australia has featured as the 10th largest Commonwealth trading partner, 7 places above India, followed by Canada and India itself. India and Canada have also been identified by Birmingham City University in one of its reports as 2 countries where growth could be achieved post-Brexit. Those countries which do not enter into free trade agreements with the UK, of course, will be members of the World Trade Organization and have to follow their rules. Not all will be members, but most will. Generally, World Trade Organization members have lowered tariff barriers anyway with each other and must, of course, treat each other equally. Referring again to the pandemic, we cannot underestimate the impact the coronavirus has had and will have on global economies, on both demand and supply. Many Commonwealth countries are experiencing reduced import demand for their exports, having relied upon certain countries for those exports, China being a good example. There's been a strong association between China's economy and its performance and Commonwealth trade experience for the last 2 decades. In addition, many countries have had to borrow money going into debt or further debt in order to give a fiscal and monetary response stimulus to their economies as a result of COVID. Brexit may not have been timely, but whatever the conclusion of the UK-EU Brexit negotiations, we have to make it work and ensure our future trading relationships maximise the benefits for all. Streamlining trade procedures, reducing duties, sharing data and coordinating trade policy need to be maximised to help drive growth and employment. As the UK prepares to leave the European Union, nearly 1 in 5 British exporters have already changed trading partners to divert business outside the EU, a new study recently revealed. An estimated £50 billion of exports have been diverted since Brexit, since the Brexit debate in 2016, mainly thanks to micro exporters, followed by small firms and then medium-sized firms. In the Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and the sub-Saharan Africa have benefited from this 50 million. Outside the Commonwealth, so have Russia and Brazil. Let me conclude by quoting the Commonwealth Secretariat. Commonwealth countries can do much more to expand trade links with the UK post-Brexit. And a short and obvious unquestionable quote, again from a recent BCU report entitled Making a Success of Brexit. The process of leaving must be made a success. There is no option. From my point of view, the UK's membership of the EU does not and never did limit our engagement with the Commonwealth. Commonwealth opportunities and growing Commonwealth opportunities for UK business present themselves all of the time if we choose to pursue them. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. What I'd invite the other speakers to do is to mute themselves so we can actually have a, if you like, a five-way conversation, and I'll go through the sort of the couple of questions we've got, and then just raise some any other points that sort of become relevant. I mean, firstly, that the question that sort of goes through my mind is that I mean, we all know that Brexit was a political vote by everyone who had that potential to cast their vote, and on a sort of just over 70% turnout, we got some interesting figures. It's interesting when I come back to you, Nicola, that in Scotland you look at 38%, or only 38% of Scottish people, or those who vote in Scotland, wanted to leave. But of course, leave that they will do. So presumably your view is that this is going to turbocharge the sort of the move towards independence.
Well, as I indicated in the presentation, we've already seen a shift in public opinion. We've in both directions, actually. So there has been some shift away from independence among those who had voted yes in 2014 but voted leave in 2016, but we've also seen a bigger shift from those who had voted no in 2014 to independence but to remain in 2016, and there are a lot more of them, as you pointed out. So the net effect is that you do have increased support for independence. That explains some of the shift, but it doesn't explain all of it, and there does seem to be, seems to have been a COVID effect this year as well, in pushing support for independence up a bit. But I mean, my point, I suppose, is that I'm not sure that opinion polls at the moment are all that reliable, because we're seeing, I mean, I think they're reliably representing opinion as it stands now, but that's opinion without there really being any discussion about independence. It's in the background. It will come to the fore in the run up to the elections next May, but probably more about the right to decide rather than the detail. And the detail is made much more complex by Brexit.
Well, absolutely. In fact, that was the next point I was going to come on to, that the problem was that it was a fairly binary decision. Do you want to stay or go? And that was it, you know. And maybe the sort of I suspect that any government thinking about having a referendum on such a major issue in the future will think very carefully about the sort of the precise terms. And if I remember correctly, the sort of the original decision for Scottish Welsh devolution, that was it 2/3 majority?
Yeah, but there was no threshold.
No threshold.
So,
okay.
yeah, so there was no threshold required, but in Scotland it was, I think, 3/4 actually that.
3/4, sorry. Yeah.
And then 2/3 for taxpayers. But in
Yeah.
Wales, obviously, it was a wafer thin majority, and that was fine. That was all that was required legally. Obviously, the more support you have, the more consensus there is to start a new journey.
Yeah.
But no.
Bringing people with you is important, yeah. And you know, if anything, Brexit has increased those divisions. So, and just coming back to you, I mean, one of the issues that I'm hearing about and sort of certainly reading about is the sort of the shipping costs. Now, this is a direct consequence of COVID, and excuse me, containers being in the wrong place and ships not being able to get into port. Is that something you're hearing from members?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think a challenge that a lot of businesses are telling us is the disruption of supply chains through the crisis, and also particularly those businesses rely on supply chains, but don't have necessarily a diversity of suppliers. For example, being hit hardest, I think. So that has meant some issues as we moved out of restrictions, things being in the wrong place, and, as you say, costs associated with that. What we've also seen is some temporary reshoring with some businesses and shortening of supply chains. Now, the question is whether that's a temporary shift to manage the current crisis, or whether it's a more permanent shift. And of course, there's a Brexit element to this as well, and how businesses manage that. So that's quite interesting going forward. And I think there may not be an overall answer to that question. I think it might be more sector by sector in terms of how that's managed going forward.
Yeah, I think we're in for some difficult times, whatever happens. The confluence of COVID and Brexit is not a good one. What I'm going to do is actually is concentrate on the sort of the questions that we've had in. And if I can actually sort of, this one's for you, Keith, and I'll come back to you, Suren, in a moment, because there's a couple of questions for you. Thank you, Keith, for reminding us of the world beyond the EU, exclamation mark, which of course is what Brexit was always supposed to be about. The Commission's own prediction is that some 90% of world growth will come from outside the EU in the next 20 years. How do you see the opportunities beyond the Commonwealth?
How do I see beyond the Commonwealth? Well, based on the current trends beyond the Commonwealth, it would appear that countries like Brazil and much to my surprise, Russia are showing better opportunities, or some opportunities for trade. I hadn't really thought beyond the Commonwealth myself. Obviously, America is a major trading partner. It's second after the EU as far as we are concerned. So I anticipate, depending on the deal we have with America, of course, if we do have a trade agreement, picking up more trade between us and America. But beyond the Commonwealth, I'm afraid it's not my greatest area of expertise. 53 countries is enough to try and understand and be aware of. But beyond that, I hope to see improved trade within the Commonwealth, I have to say, particularly our current major trading partners, India, Canada and Australia. And I think there is potential there. As I said, there always has been. We just never have taken the opportunity to pursue it. We seem to be a little risk averse, unlike companies like Germany, who are certainly out there. And maybe in Africa, the non-Commonwealth countries in Africa, there's only 19 out of the 53, 54 countries on the African continent. So there's a substantial number of other African countries where I think there's a great potential for trade. So as I say, it's not my area of expertise beyond the Commonwealth, but that's my initial thought.
Don't worry. Well, I'll pose that then to Nicola, Suren, David. Any views? David, we can't hear you.
I'm not muted.
Oh, right. Okay. We can hear you now.
Right. I think there's certainly potential to grow trade with various partners. China is an obvious example of a large and rapidly growing economy. There's scope to, even with so-called older economies like Japan, well-developed economies, there's scope to increase trade. For me, the real question is, to what extent does leaving the EU facilitate that, or enhance those opportunities? And the answer at the moment seems to be, actually, it's the additional opportunities that derive from not being an EU member state are extremely limited. The impediments, as Keith has already alluded to, the impediments to us trading with a number of these countries inside and outside of the Commonwealth have not predominantly been related to our EU membership. Now, there might be a possibility of agreeing an enhanced deal with some countries, but there are a number of very, very difficult domestic pressures that many face. You know, if you take the example of somewhere like India, for example, there are a number of very strong domestic pressures that will make coming to an agreement that would substantially benefit British firms in a way that we couldn't do as EU members quite difficult. So I think, for me, yes, there are lots of opportunities, and certainly take advantage of them, but those opportunities were there anyway. They don't derive from leaving the EU.
Okay, yeah, indeed. Nicola, because it's Scotland, which, who knows, if we speak in about 10 years' time, may be independent and trading with the EU. Any views about where Scotland will go?
Sorry, in what respect?
Well, in terms of sort of overseas trade.
It's not my area of expertise,
okay.
But yeah.
No, don't worry.
Okay.
Suren, coming back to you, somebody did ask the sort of question, do you have a report that, in fact, I'll quote here, because it's important. Thank you, Suren, for an excellent overview of the business view of the Brexit business level of preparedness. Have you published a report? So you can answer that question in a moment. But in terms of sort of the general opportunities that exist for businesses in the West Midlands, looking beyond the sort of the EU and other developed countries.
Yes, so the first question, yes, we have published a report. I think it's available west. I think I might put a link to it in the Q&A, but I'll share more generally at the end of this webinar. So I would agree. I mean, I think when you speak to our members, I think what they say at the moment is that the overwhelming majority will say that they want to maintain existing links as a priority, because I think they've been through enough disruption over the last few years, and I think looking as much as possible. That's why, for example, I think Keith made the point around the continuity agreements. I think that they're really important, and they're seen as an important next step alongside getting a trade deal with the EU. Beyond that, I think we're quite surprised. Members are quite surprised in terms of the focus on sort of Australia, New Zealand, and the TPP, I think if I've got in the right order, and the focus on joining that. I think that seems to be the overall strategy for UK government, where actually a lot of focus is on some of those growth markets, and I think China was mentioned, but also other places in sort of Southeast Asia as well. I think those are places that I think a lot of members are quite interested in and going forward. But again, the immediate priority for a lot of members is trying to maintain existing sort of access that they have now under existing EU arrangements.
Just actually as a follow-up, somebody's mentioned here, and it's not meant to be a criticism, that you didn't mention 2019 global foreign direct investment flows were flat, according to the I'll pronounce this, UNCTAD figures, although pre-COVID figures were expected to rise, but now current research indicates a fall due to the pandemic. What reflection of the research by UNCTAD did Suren take into the presentation?
So we haven't specifically referenced that, but I think that the point I made in my sort of presentation around sort of investment, I think that's a critical issue here. So we talked about domestic sort of private sector investment in the UK, but of course, as I mentioned in the question, foreign direct investments clearly going to be a key issue going forward, because if nothing else changes, clearly the UK post the energy transition period is going to be less attractive than they were beforehand, because one of the attractions of the UK, of investing in the UK for overseas companies, is an open door to the EU market. And depending on what we get, to a greater extent, that door will be a little more closed than it was obviously previous on the current arrangements. So that's going to be a key challenge. But of course, what it also does is provide opportunities or alternatives. So of course, the UK is one of the largest economies in the world. So the focus needs to be, if you're looking to try and maintain foreign direct investment into the UK, is how do you make the UK as attractive as possible for that type of investment, to try and make up for that shortfall of not having access to the market. So this looks at things like infrastructure, investment, financing, and people as well. I think that's those are probably the three key areas that we want to focus on. So it really needs sort of refocusing on a real sort of economic strategy for the UK sort of post the end of the transition period.
Okay, there's a kind of final general question that's been asked here. It's one of these questions that I hope doesn't come to pass, but it does actually say or state, in the case of no deal, the comparative advantage for foreign companies in the UK might be going to be lost due to leaving the EU single market. Well, in fact, well, let's face it, we are no longer part of the single market. So the question is, what kind of policies are needed to maintain British economic competitiveness? So if you can, in fewer than 100 words, I guess, because this is a real big one. So if I could go around, whoever wants to take that one first.
Shall I kick off? Obviously, we entered into a significant number of free trade agreements with Commonwealth countries. That's 53 countries for a start. Also, the pound and the currency fluctuations are a major player when it comes to trading, of course, exports and imports. It's to make it come. I talked to a colleague yesterday and picking up the point about the extra freight costs going up due to COVID. It's really the extra freight costs plus the currency fluctuations are impacting severely on his business, to the point of impacting on its profit or not profit on the particular deal. But I think for me, the trade agreements are out there, taking down all the barriers relevant to trading with Commonwealth countries. And beyond that, it's just improving the trade flows and making trade barriers less defensive.
Anyone else?
I think there's, to a certain extent, a limit to what can be done. Depends very much on the kind of relationship that you adopt, both with the EU and partners further afield. There's nothing that stipulates the UK has to leave the single market or cannot rejoin the single market. We don't need to be members of the EU in order to be part of the European Economic Area. So there's certainly, you know, if you look forward 5 years' time, you might say, actually, that's something that would be interested in readopting and in becoming part of again, without necessarily all the trappings of full EU membership. So there are disadvantages to that as well, of course. But I kind of point out that these things are unlikely to be set in stone forever, and whatever relationship we have with the rest of the EU and further afield from January, that isn't the final chapter in this story. This is something that will go on and on and on and on, and we'll see an evolution of those relationships in one direction or another over time, and that will impact business competitiveness. The second point is that although there's a limit to what you can do, there are good strategies you can adopt anyway, whether or not you're members of the EU, whether or not you have agreements with anywhere else. So adopting an effective industrial strategy, and I use that term very broadly, not just for industry, but the service sector as well, but adopting a sensible industrial strategy that focuses very clearly on ensuring the right conditions for growth are there is a strong positive. Investing more and investing better, so to speak, in education is another strong positive. Ensuring your population have the technical skills that you need, that businesses need in order to grow and develop further is a strong action you can take. And ensuring that actually power is moved to a more local level to ensure that different parts of the country where needs are very, very different. The situation, for example, in the West Midlands, where I live, is quite different to that in London, which is itself quite different to that in Edinburgh or other, parts of more remote parts of Scotland. All of those places have very, very different economic needs, and so effective policy needs to be devolved to the most appropriate level.
Okay, I mean, I will really push the time, but I'm just going to ask this as a final question. We should, in theory, go into a period of stability, but there doesn't seem to be much of that about. I mean, I know in Scotland you're going to have elections in the sort of next forthcoming year, which may sort of determine its future. But I just wonder that, we're due to have another general election, everything sort of being equal, in 2024. Do you think the sort of Europe and the question of sort of membership of the EU or Brexit or whatever it is called that time, do you think it will have any sort of bearing? Because I get the sense from the few people I come into contact with that Brexit is an issue that for the majority of people outside, of course, of the informed chatter, it's not really a major concern. And of course, we know we're going through the pandemic and all of that will entail. And I saw a report yesterday which saying that many more jobs will be lost due to automation. So I just wonder how all of that will play out in terms of the next few years, and certainly by the time we get to another election in 4 years' time.
So shall I come
in? Sorry, it was a long question. Quick answer would be really good.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I agree with everything that David said about the issue continuing, and the relationship between the UK and the EU continuing to matter, and probably continuing to matter politically. I don't see any prospect for stability in the short term on any of these issues. And while it's always been the case that for voters, if you ask them to prioritise a list of things that matter to them, any sort of constitutional issue, including Brexit, including devolution or whatever, it's going to come quite low down the list. But if there is a political party that is linking those sorts of constitutional type issues with the things that do matter to them, whether it's investment in education, whether it's jobs or the economy or the NHS or whatever, then of course it will still matter politically in the elections to come.
Right, okay.
And I mean, I think it possibly could do, but I think it will be dwarfed by the next election being thought over what happens around public finances post-COVID, because you'll be getting to the period where government may have to make quite difficult decisions around taxation, and I think that might, and different strategies around that, how you restore the public finances, and whatever definition you look at will be sort of what next election is fought over.
Thank you, Suren. Keith?
No, I've no further contribution to make on that, Steve, but what I'm going to do is very cheeky before we finish. Can I give a plug for the Greater Birmingham Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce? And I've seen you've had a chat on the chat line, chats from Australia, etc. Anybody interested in trading with the Commonwealth, if they'd like to contact the Greater Birmingham Commonwealth Chamber of Commerce, we'd be very pleased to help them. Indeed, even the Birmingham Commonwealth Association. So sorry to be cheeky.
No. It's a perfect place to plug, so please do so.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And finally, David.
I'm not a politician, and I'm not a student of politics. So, my contribution is perhaps limited to a personal opinion, but I don't see these issues. I don't see disruption, and I don't see disruptive issues going away anytime soon. I think that the conversation is likely to change and evolve, but I don't think it's going to stop. One thing I don't see happening in the near future is much discussion in England, Scotland notwithstanding, of rejoining the EU. I think that we might move to a closer relationship. There might be a discussion over that, but I think the question over rejoining the EU is that's done for the time being.
That's certainly very much on the long finger, as they say, but events in sort of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and potentially Wales may move in a different direction. Look, I mean, the fact is that sort of the misattributed quote of "May you live in interesting times" being a curse. It seems very true at this moment. We do live in extremely interesting times. Thanks for the contribution of all the panel, to Nicola, to Keith, to Suren, and to David. It's been my pleasure to step in at the sort of the last minute and to host this. And with just over a week to go to Christmas, I wish everyone all the festive greetings. And I hope that 2021 is a sort of better year in every regard. I'm tempted to say it can hardly be any worse. But we can only sort of be optimistic about our sort of prospects. So with that, I wish everyone a good day, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.